The wind in Dry Creek had a voice, a low, mournful whisper that scoured the clabbered faces of the buildings and carried the grit of the plains into every crack and crevice. It was a sound Jack Callahan knew well, the sound of endings. He stood in the shadow of the assayer's office, and the brim of his hat pulled low, his gaze fixed on the saloon doors across the street. The sun beat down with a merciless white-hot intensity, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the dust into a fine red powder that clung to his worn leather duster. He was no longer a marshal. The silver star that had once been a part of him, a weight on his chest and in his soul, now sat wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a locked chest back at the ranch. But the instincts, the predator's patience, had never left him. For 3 weeks, he had been a ghost, drifting from one godforsaken settlement to the next, following the trail of rumor and blood left by Silas Blackwood. And now the trail had ended here. The saloon doors swung open, spilling a wave of stale air, cheap whiskey, and tinny piano music into the street. Silas Blackwood stepped out, a silhouette against the dim interior. He was not a large man, but he moved with a coiled stillness that promised violence. He paused on the boardwalk, pulling a cheroot from his pocket and striking a match against the doorframe. The flame illuminated a face that was all sharp angles and shadows, with eyes that seemed to drink the light and give nothing back. He looked directly at Jack, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his lips. The hunt was over. The confrontation had begun. Jack pushed himself off the wall, his boots making no sound in the thick dust as he crossed the street. The town seemed to hold its breath. Faces vanished from windows. The piano music faltered, then died completely. There was only the whisper of the wind and the steady, unhurried rhythm of Jack's approach. He stopped 10 feet from the outlaw, his hand hovering near the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Blackwood Jack's voice was a low rasp, dry as the air he breathed. "It's over." Silas took a long, deliberate drag from his cheroot, the ember glowing like a malevolent eye. "Over, Marshal." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "I'd say it's just getting started." He exhaled a plume of smoke that the wind immediately tore to shreds. "You look tired. Been a long ride, has it?" "Give it back," Jack said, ignoring the taunt. His eyes were locked on the glint of silver at Silas's throat. A chain, and hanging from it, a small oval locket. Silas's smile widened. He touched the locket with the tip of his finger, a gesture of obscene intimacy. This old thing, founded on a dead man. Or was it a dying one? It's hard to keep track. The lie was a slap. Jack's knuckles went white where he gripped the handle of his Colt. He had been tracking a bank robbery, a simple job for a local sheriff who'd paid him under the table. He'd cornered Silas and his men in a narrow canyon pass. In the chaos of the firefight, Silas had closed the distance, not for the money pouch, but for him. He'd ripped the locket from Jack's neck as he lay stunned from a ricochet, the chain snapping the loss, a physical blow that hurt more than any bullet could. "That locket belongs to me," Jack said, his voice dangerously low. "Does it now?" Silas's eyes glinted with a cruel amusement. He held it up, letting it twist in the sunlight. "Funny. I feel like I have more of a right to it than you ever did." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You took what mattered most from me, Marshal. It's only fair I return the favor." The words were a puzzle Jack couldn't solve. He'd put away dozens of men, killed his share in the line of duty. Blackwood was just another name on a long list of faceless criminals. There was nothing personal between them. Or so he had thought. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, his focus unwavering. Give me the locket and I'll walk away. I don't wear a star anymore. This isn't my fight." "Oh, but it is, Silas," hissed his smile, vanishing, replaced by a mask of pure distilled hatred. "It has always been your fight. You just didn't know it." In a flash of movement too quick to follow, Silas drew his pistol. But he didn't aim at Jack. He fired into the dust at Jack's feet once, twice, kicking up plumes of red earth. It wasn't an attack. It was a distraction. As Jack instinctively flinched, Silas turned and sprinted for the alley beside the saloon. Jack drew his own weapon, the smooth, worn metal familiar, in his hand. He could have shot him. A clean shot to the back. The old Jack the Marshal would have. But he hesitated. It wasn't about justice. It was about the locket. He needed it back whole. He holstered his gun and gave chase, his long legs eating up the ground. He rounded the corner into the alley just in time to see Silas leap onto the back of a waiting horse. Silas wheeled the animal around, its eyes wide with panic. He looked down at Jack, in his face a mask of triumph. "This is for you, Callahan," he yelled. And then his gaze shifted past Jack toward the far end of the alley. A small boy, no older than 7, had wandered out from the back of the general store, clutching a bright red candy stick. The boy froze, his eyes wide saucers of terror. Silas raised his pistol. Jack's blood ran cold. "No!" he roared, a primal scream of desperation. He threw himself forward, not at Silas, but toward the child, shielding him with his own body. He braced for the impact, the searing pain of the bullet. But it never came. Instead, he heard the thunder of hooves and a wild, echoing laugh. When Jack looked up, Silas was gone, a dwindling figure disappearing into the shimmering heat haze of the plains. The locket, Eleonora's locket, was gone with him. The boy began to cry, the candy stick forgotten in the dust. Jack knelt, his own hands trembling, and helped the child to his feet. He was safe. But as Jack watched the empty horizon, a cold dread settled in his gut. Silas hadn't been aiming for the boy. He had been aiming for Jack's soul. He had forced Jack to choose between the memory of his wife and the life of a child, a cruel, calculated test. And with that single, chilling act, Silas had made it clear this was not about a stolen piece of silver. It was a reckoning. The ride home was a silent pilgrimage through a landscape of ghosts. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood, and bruised purple blazing like forge embers under an unforgiving sky. The air was so dry, it tasted of dust and regret. Jack pushed his horse on the animal's weary sighs, mingling with his own. He was riding away from a failure, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was riding toward a battlefield. The ranch was nestled in a small, defensible valley, a solitary outpost of order against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The house stood dark and silent, a sentinel of grief. He dismounted, the squeak of leather, the only sound to greet him. As he walked toward the porch, the familiar weight of silence pressed down, heavier than any physical burden. Inside the house was a shrine to a life that had ended. Eleonora's rocking chair sat by the cold hearth, a fine layer of dust tracing the elegant curve of its arms. The table was set for 3, but the third plate, his own, held only the cold remnants of a meal he hadn't been there to share. The air was thick with things left unsaid, with a sorrow so profound it had become a permanent part of the structure, as integral as the wooden beams and stone foundation. He found them in their room. David, his eldest at 12, sat on the edge of his bed, ramrod straight, staring at the wall. He was trying so hard to be the man of the house, to carry a weight no boy should ever have to bear. His face, a young, unlined version of Jack's own, was a mask of stoicism, but his hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. Luke, only 7, was curled under his blankets, a small, still mound. Jack knew without having to look that his son was clutching the small wooden bird Eleonora had carved for him the winter before she died. It was his talisman, his last tangible link to a mother's love. Luke wasn't asleep. He was hiding from a world that had become too quiet, too empty. "I'm back," Jack said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive hush. David didn't turn. "Heard you ride in." His tone was flat accusatory. "You were gone. You left us." The words hung unspoken between them. Jack walked over to Luke's bed and gently pulled back the blanket. His youngest son's eyes were open wide and dark in the dim light, glistening with unshed tears. He didn't speak, just tightened his grip on the wooden bird. "He wouldn't eat," David said, still not looking at him. "Said he'd wait for you." Guilt, sharp and familiar, twisted in Jack's gut. He had been chasing a ghost, a piece of silver, while his own sons were turning into ghosts themselves. He sat on the edge of Luke's bed, the mattress sighing under his weight. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered, stroking Luke's hair. The boy flinched at the contact, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it felt like a chasm opening between them. The house had been silent since Eleonora's passing, a suffocating quiet that swallowed laughter and smothered comfort. It was a silence born of shared unspoken pain. They communicated in whispers, in gestures, and the careful avoidance of each other's eyes. Jack saw the dust gathering on his wife's books, the way her favorite shawl still lay draped over the back of her chair, untouched, and he did nothing. To move them would be to admit she was truly gone. To disturb the silence would be to let the grief rush in a flood that he feared would drown them all. He had thought hunting Blackwood was a way to protect her memory, a final act of service. But standing in the hollow quiet of his son's room and the empty space on his chest, where the locket used to be a cold phantom ache, he understood his folly. He hadn't been protecting her memory. He had been running from the crushing responsibility of being a father to two boys who had lost their world. He had left them alone in the silence. And now, Silas Blackwood, a man with a vendetta he didn't understand, was out there. That cryptic warning, "You took what mattered most from me," echoed in his mind. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A promise that the violence he had tried to leave behind would follow him home. He looked at his son, so small and fragile in the encroaching darkness, and knew he could not run anymore. He had to prepare for the storm that was coming. 2 days later, the storm arrived, not with thunder and lightning, but with the tired clopping of a single horse. Sheriff Miller from the nearby town of Redemption dismounted with the stiff, pained movements of a man whose bones ached with the memory of too many years in the saddle. He was a good man, but a cautious one, a bureaucrat in a Stetson who preferred paperwork to gun smoke. "Jack," he said, accepting the cup of water Jack offered. He wiped the dust from his mustache and sighed. "Got a wire this morning. Figured you'd want to know." A man fitting Silas Blackwood's description was seen just outside of Redemption, asking questions, ruffling feathers. Jack's hand tightened around his own cup. Redemption. The new railroad town booming with speculators, laborers, and the kind of scum that followed money and opportunity like flies to a corpse. What kind of questions? Sheriff Miller shifted his weight, avoiding Jack's gaze. That's the thing. Wasn't asking about payrolls or bank schedules. He was asking about land. Specifically land out this way. He finally looked at Jack, his eyes full of a weary concern. He asked about your ranch, Jack. By name. The cold dread from the alley in Dry Creek returned sharper this time. This was no random outlaw. This was a predator circling its prey. Silas wasn't just passing through, he was closing in. I have to go after him, Jack said, the decision solidifying in his mind. It wasn't about the locket anymore. It was about the two boys inside the house who believed their father was invincible. It was a lie, but it was a lie he had to maintain for their sake. I was afraid you'd say that Miller sighed. Be careful, Jack. Redemption's a hornet's nest. The railroad company runs that town, and their foreman, a fella named Davies, he's got the law in his pocket. He won't take kindly to an ex-marshal stirring up trouble. Jack nodded, his mind already turning over the problem of his sons. He couldn't take them with him, and he couldn't leave them alone. The solution came to him, a grim necessity he had been avoiding for months. I need a favor, Sheriff, Jack said. There's a woman, Rose. An arrangement was made through the church. A marriage of convenience. I need you to see she gets here. Today. It was a cold, practical transaction. He needed a housekeeper, a caregiver for his sons. And Rose, an orphan with no prospects, needed a home. The arrangement felt shameful, a betrayal of Eleonora's memory. But the threat of Silas Blackwood overshadowed everything. He was trading one ghost for the safety of his children. Sheriff Miller brought her that evening just as the sun was setting. She arrived in a dusty wagon, a single small satchel, her only possession. She was younger than Jack had pictured, with quiet, observant eyes that seemed to take in everything at once: the starkness of the ranch, the grief that clung to the walls, the wariness in his own posture. Her name was Rose, and she carried herself with a resilient stillness that reminded him painfully of his wife. He met her on the porch, his sons hiding behind him, peeking around his legs. "This is David," Jack said, his voice clipped and formal. "And this is Luke." David stared at her, his expression a perfect imitation of his father's gruff suspicion. "We don't need anyone," he muttered, his voice a low growl for a boy of 12. Luke said nothing. He shrank further behind Jack's leg, his small hand clutching the wooden bird so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked at Rose, not with anger, but with a deep, heart-wrenching sorrow, as if her very presence was an erasure of his mother. Rose knelt, moving slowly so as not to frighten them. Her dialogue was not with words, but with a gentle calm. "It's a long ride," she said, her voice soft, but not weak. "I'd be grateful for a glass of water." She looked at Luke, her gaze falling to the wooden bird in his hand. "That's a beautiful carving. Did you make it?" Luke shook his head, pressing the bird to his chest, as if to protect it from her gaze. "My mother made it," David said, his tone a challenge. Rose's expression softened with a genuine sadness that caught Jack off guard. "She must have loved you very much," she said simply. In that moment, Jack saw that this was not just a transaction for her either. She was stepping into a house of pain, and she knew it. He had brought her here to be a shield for his family, but he hadn't considered the wounds she might suffer in the process. "The well is out back," Jack said, his tone harsher than he intended. "The boys will show you your room." He turned to leave the hunt for Silas, already pulling him away. He needed to pack, to clean his weapons, to become the man he used to be. He was a father sending his sons to be cared for by a stranger, also he could chase a man who held a piece of his past. The irony was a bitter pill. He was leaving his home to protect it, abandoning his family to save them. As he walked toward the barn, he heard Rose's quiet voice behind him, not demanding, but inviting. Perhaps she was saying to the boys, "You could tell me her name, your mother's." There was a long pause, filled only by the whisper of the evening wind. Then he heard David's voice, small and hesitant. "Eleonora." Jack stopped, his back to them, his eyes closing against a sudden sting. It was the first time either of his sons had spoken her name aloud in months. The town of Redemption was a raw, open wound on the face of the prairie. It had sprung up almost overnight, a chaotic jumble of canvas tents, hastily erected wooden storefronts, and muddy streets churned by the endless traffic of wagons and work crews. It smelled of sawdust, sweat, and greed. The railroad was coming, a serpent of iron and steam, and redemption was the temporary heart of the beast, pumping men and money into the wilderness. Jack began his investigation at the source, the railroad office. It was the only building in town with 2 stories and a coat of fresh paint. Inside, a harried clerk directed him to the office of the foreman, a man named Davies. Mr. Davies was a man who looked soft, but was built of something hard. He had a round, fleshy face, a neatly trimmed mustache, and hands that were conspicuously clean. He dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the dust-choked town, and his office was an oasis of civilization, with a thick rug on the floor and a decanter of amber liquid on his polished desk. Mr. Callahan Davies said, his voice as smooth and polished as his furniture. He gestured to a leather chair. Sheriff Miller sent a wire. Said you might be stopping by. A former U.S. Marshal, is that right? Quite the honor. There was an undercurrent to his helpfulness, a slickness that put Jack on edge. I'm looking for a man, Jack said, getting straight to the point. Goes by Silas Blackwood. He was seen around here. Davies steepled his clean fingers, his expression one of practiced concern. Blackwood. Can't say I know the name. We get all sorts passing through Mr. Callahan. Laborers, gamblers, fortune seekers. It's a busy time. He was asking about land, Jack pressed. Ranches east of here. Mine specifically. A flicker of something annoyance recognition passed through Davies' eyes before being smoothed over. Is that so? Well, the railroad is buying up property all along the proposed line. Perhaps this Mr. Blackwood is a speculator. There are many such men looking to profit from our endeavor. He smiled, a thin, placid expression that didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid I can't help you. My business is laying track, not keeping tabs on every drifter who rides into town. The dismissal was polite but firm. Jack knew he was being stonewalled. Davies was hiding something. As Jack left the office, the foreman's parting words followed him down the stairs. Do be careful, Mr. Callahan. Redemption can be unpredictable for those who ask too many questions. It was advice wrapped around a threat. Jack's next stop was the livery stable, a place where gossip flowed more freely than water. The stable was run by an old hand named Elias, a man whose skin was the color and texture of cracked leather, and whose eyes held the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen it all. He moved slowly, his joints stiff, but his hands were sure as he worked a brush over a horse's flank. Help you? Elias asked, not looking up from his work. Looking for information, Jack said, leaning against a stall. He described Silas Blackwood. Elias stopped brushing and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Yeah, I seen him. Asked about renting a horse a few days back. Mean-looking sort. Had eyes like a rattler. Did he say where he was headed? Nope. But he wasn't just passing through, Elias said, finally turning to look at Jack. His gaze was sharp, insightful. He had a map. One of them survey maps from the railroad company. He was asking questions, all right. But not about buying land. This was the first real crack in Davies' story. What was he asking about? Jack asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Deeds, Elias said, his voice dropping. Land deeds. Kept pointing to the patch of valley your ranch sits in. Asked me who had the oldest claim, who had water rights, who might be persuaded to sell. Elias squinted, his folksy demeanor sharpening. This town's full of liars, Marshal. But the biggest ones wear the fanciest suits. You want to find your man, don't follow his tracks. Follow the money. The clue was a vital piece of the puzzle. Silas's interest wasn't random. It was strategic. The land deeds, the railroad map, Davies' deception, it all pointed to a larger scheme. This was no longer just about a personal vendetta. It was about his home, his land, the only thing he had left to give his sons. The stakes had just been raised. While Jack navigated the currents of corruption and redemption, a different kind of struggle was unfolding back at the ranch. Rose moved through the silent house like a ghost, trying to find her place in a home that was not hers, with a family defined by a woman she had never known. The grief was a physical presence, a cold draft that no fire could warm. She began with small things. She aired out the stuffy rooms, letting the sunlight and dry desert air chase away the stale scent of sorrow. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, and she cooked simple meals that filled the kitchen with the aroma of baking bread and simmering beans. At first, the boys watched her with guarded suspicion. David, in his self-appointed role as his father's deputy, observed her every move, his arms crossed, his young face set in a permanent scowl. Luke would hide in corners, clutching his wooden bird, his large, sad eyes following her as she worked. One afternoon, driven by a need to understand the woman whose shadow she lived in, Rose found herself standing before a closed door at the end of the hall. Dust lay thick on the threshold. This was Eleonora's room. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was perfectly preserved, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment. A book lay open on the bedside table, a silver-backed brush sat on the dresser, and a half-finished piece of sewing lay in a basket by the window. It was here, tucked inside a small wooden chest at the foot of the bed, that she found Eleonora's journal. She hesitated, feeling like a trespasser, a profaner of sacred ground. But the need to understand, to connect the pieces of this broken family, was stronger than her guilt. She sat in the rocking chair by the window and began to read. The journal was filled with the details of a life lived with love, descriptions of wildflowers, recipes for pies, funny anecdotes about the boys. But as she read further, a different tone emerged. In entries from the last year of her life, Eleonora wrote of a shadow that had fallen over her husband. Jack returned from the Blackwood territory today. One entry read, "Something happened there. He will not speak of it, but I see it in his eyes. A darkness he carries alone. He mentioned a family, the Blackwoods. There was an accident, a terrible mistake. He fears it will follow him. He fears he does not deserve forgiveness." The name struck Rose like a physical blow. Blackwood. The same name as the man Jack was hunting. It wasn't a coincidence. This was the root of it, all the secret Jack carried, the source of the darkness his wife had seen. She tucked the journal away, the leather cover feeling heavy with the weight of this new knowledge. Her bond with the boys was forged in the crucible of a crisis. One night, Luke woke with a cry, his body burning with fever. He tossed and turned, his whispers a fevered litany of one word, "Mama." Rose sat by his side for 3 days and 3 nights, bathing his forehead with cool water and forcing sips of herbal tea between his cracked lips. David stood vigil in the doorway, his tough exterior crumbling with every pained breath his younger brother took. He watched Rose, saw her exhaustion, her unwavering care. And for the first time, his gaze held something other than suspicion. It held a flicker of grudging respect. On the 3rd night, as Luke's fever finally broke, he stirred and looked at Rose with clear eyes, his small hand reaching for hers. He didn't speak, but the simple, trusting gesture was more powerful than any words. She had passed a test she didn't know she was taking. Back in Redemption, Jack was piecing together the rest of Silas's plan. He learned that several small ranchers whose properties bordered the proposed railroad line had been forced to sell their land in recent weeks. Some were bought out for pennies on the dollar. Others were driven off by threats and mysterious fires. All the deeds had been transferred to a shell company controlled by one man, Mr. Davies. The plan was clear. Silas was acting as Davies's enforcer, clearing a path for the railroad. But it didn't explain the final piece, why the path led directly to Jack's ranch. His land wasn't essential for the main line. It was a spur, a dead end. He searched the county records office, digging through dusty ledgers until his fingers were black with ink. He found what he was looking for in a territorial survey from decades prior. An old, forgotten claim filed long before his own. A claim registered under the name of Abel Blackwood, and beside it a note. Younger sons, Thomas and Daniel. Silas was not his real name. The focus on his land, Eleonora's mention of the Blackwood family, the old deed the pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture of a past he had tried to bury, a past that was now coming to claim him. The vendetta wasn't just personal, it was ancestral. He was living on land they believed was theirs. The truth came not in a dusty office, but in the filth of a back-alley brawl. Jack finally cornered one of Silas's men, a wiry gunman with shifty eyes behind a gambling den. The fight was short and brutal. Jack slammed the man against a brick wall, the barrel of his Colt pressed hard under the man's chin. "Where is he?" Jack snarled. The gunman, blood trickling from his lip, gave a wheezing, desperate laugh. "You still don't get it, do you, Marshal?" "Get what?" "He ain't Silas. That's just a name he uses. His real name is Thomas Blackwood." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Thomas and Daniel. He remembered the file, the incident report he himself had written and then sealed. The gunman saw the recognition in Jack's eyes and twisted the knife. "Silas Thomas, he doesn't want your land. He just wants to take it from you piece by piece before he takes everything else. He wants you to feel what he felt. He wants your life." The man's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "You took his brother from him, Marshal. An eye for an eye." The world tilted on its axis. The shootout in the Blackwood territory. It hadn't been a clean fight against outlaws, as the official report stated. It had been a chaotic ambush. A family of homesteaders, the Blackwoods, had been caught in the crossfire between his posse and a band of rustlers. In the confusion, a stray bullet, his bullet, had struck an unarmed boy who had run out from a cabin. Daniel Blackwood, a boy of 16, an innocent. The entire vendetta was a lie built around a horrific truth. The stolen locket, a cruel parody of Jack's loss. The scheme to take his land, an elaborate effort to bankrupt him, to isolate him, to strip him of everything he had built. It was all a slow, torturous prelude to a final act of revenge. Silas Thomas Blackwood was methodically destroying Jack's life before taking it a punishment designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain. The story was no longer a hunt for an outlaw. It was a ghost story. And Jack was both the hunter and the haunted, caught in a deeply personal war over a sin he had buried a long, long time ago. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a hell of his own making. The revelation had shattered him, leaving him hollowed out, the pieces of his life rearranged into a picture of guilt and consequence. Every rock and cactus seemed to mock him, silent witnesses to the lie he had lived for years. Thomas Blackwood's face, contorted with hatred, was burned into his memory. But beneath it, he saw another face, Daniel's, young and startled in the split second before the bullet struck. He arrived home looking like a man who had seen a ghost. His face pale and drawn, his eyes clouded with a despair so deep it seemed to suck the light from the room. Rose saw it the moment he walked through the door. The boys ran to him, but he barely registered their presence. He knelt mechanically, placing a hand on each of their heads, but his touch was distant, his gaze fixed on some middle distance only he could see. That night, after the children were asleep, he found Rose by the hearth. The fire cast flickering shadows on her face, illuminating her worried expression. He didn't know how to begin. The secret had been his alone for so long, a toxic lump in his soul. But the weight of it was now too much to bear. "His name is Thomas Blackwood." Jack began, his voice a dead monotone. He confessed everything, the words spilling out in a torrent of long-suppressed guilt. He told her about the ambush, the chaos, the stray bullet that had killed an innocent boy. And then he told her the worst part, the secret that had festered inside him, poisoning everything he touched. "I covered it up," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "There was an inquiry. I was a hero, Marshal, decorated, respected. A dead civilian on my record. It would have ended my career. So I wrote the report to say Daniel was armed, that he was part of the Rustler gang. I lied, to protect myself, to protect my future with Eleonora and the boys." He finally looked at her, his eyes pleading for... he didn't know what. Condemnation, absolution. Thomas was there. He saw it all. He saw his brother die, and he saw me lie about it. The hatred he feels, he earned it. I gave it to him. The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. His great shame was laid bare. He felt a perverse sense of relief, followed immediately by a wave of crushing defeat. He was paralyzed by his own guilt, convinced that he deserved whatever fate Thomas Blackwood had in store for him. The fight was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Let him come. Let him take the land, the locket, my life. It's a debt I owe. Rose listened without interruption, her hands clasped in her lap. When he finished, she didn't offer empty platitudes or easy forgiveness. Her gaze was steady, filled not with judgment, but with a profound and sorrowful understanding. "You made a mistake, Jack," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "A terrible one. You chose ambition over truth, and you have been paying for it ever since." He flinched, the simple truth of her words cutting deeper than any accusation. But she wasn't finished. She stood and walked to the small chest where she kept her few belongings. She returned with Eleonora's journal. She opened it to a page near the end, and the handwriting slightly weaker than the earlier entries, and handed it to him. He took it, his hands trembling. He read the words his wife had written just weeks before she died. "The shadow of the Blackwood boy still haunts him. He confessed it all to me tonight, his heart breaking with the guilt he has carried. He believes he is a fraud, a coward. But I see the truth. I see a good man who made a terrible choice in a moment of fear. My love for him does not waver. I know the man, he is not just the mistake he made. I pray he will one day find a way to forgive himself, to believe in his own capacity for redemption. Our family is built on his strength, and that strength is real, even if he cannot see it right now." Carter. The words were a posthumous absolution, a gift of grace from the woman he thought he had betrayed. Tears welled in Jack's eyes, hot and shameful, and finally fell tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. He had believed his lie had protected her, but she had known all along. She had known his deepest failing and had loved him anyway. Rose placed a hand on his shoulder. "She didn't love a perfect man, Jack. She loved you. This isn't just about your past anymore. Thomas Blackwood isn't just coming for the man who killed his brother. He's coming for David's father. For Luke's father." Her voice grew stronger, fiercer. "He's coming for my husband. Your guilt is a luxury we cannot afford. Your family's love, Eleonora's love, is your reason to fight. Not for survival, but for a future free from this." Her words and Eleonora's were the flicker of a lantern in his profound darkness. The guilt was still there, a heavy cloak he would carry forever. but it was no longer a shroud. His family, the one he had lost and the one he was building, was not a reminder of his failure, but a reason for his redemption. He would not let his past destroy their future. He stood up the weariness in his bones, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He would face Thomas Blackwood not as a hero or a villain, but as a father. The storm broke that night. Not a metaphorical one, but a real elemental fury that descended upon the valley. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and the wind began to howl a low, keening moan that tore at the roof of the house and rattled the window panes. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry earth to a slick, churning mud. It was as if the heavens themselves were raging against the sins of men. And in the heart of the storm he came. Jack saw him first, a lone rider emerging from the deluge, a dark specter on a dark horse. Thomas Blackwood. He wasn't coming for a fight in the open. He was coming to the heart of it all, to the ranch, to finish it. "Rose, take the boys to the root cellar," Jack ordered, his voice calm, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "Bar the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Rose's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, her face a mask of determination. She gathered the terrified boys, Luke clutching his wooden bird David, trying to look brave but failing. "Be careful," she whispered to Jack, a world of fear and hope in those two words. He watched them disappear down the cellar steps and the heavy wooden door thudding shut behind them. Now he was alone. He knew where the confrontation would happen. The barn. It was the largest structure, full of shadows and angles, a perfect stage for a final showdown. He grabbed his rifle, and his Colt checked them one last time and slipped out the back door, the wind and rain, snatching the breath from his lungs. He moved like a shadow through the storm, the familiar path to the barn, now a treacherous landscape of mud and darkness. The barn was a cavern of groaning wood and howling wind. Rain lashed against the walls, and each flash of lightning illuminated the interior in a series of stark, terrifying tableaus, and the empty stalls, the hayloft shrouded in darkness, the glint of a pitchfork leaning against a post. Jack took up a position behind a stack of hay bales, his rifle resting on top, his senses on high alert. He didn't have to wait long. The large barn doors groaned open, and Thomas Blackwood stepped inside, dripping water, his duster clinging to his lean frame. Eleanor's locket still hung around his neck, a silver taunt against the dark fabric of his shirt. He stood in the center of the barn, turning slowly, his pistol in hand. "Callahan." His voice was a roar that barely carried over the storm. "Come out and face me. Let's end this like men." Jack remained silent, motionless. This wasn't a duel of honor. This was a hunt. His wits, not his speed, would be his greatest weapon. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, their eyes met across the barn. Thomas smiled, a feral, joyless expression. "There you are." He fired the shot, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet thudded into the hay bale inches from Jack's head. Jack returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to drive him to cover. Thomas dove behind a water trough, and the battle began. It was a deadly dance of shadows and light. A flash of lightning would reveal a position, followed by a deafening gunshot. The wind howled, the rain hammered down, and the air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet earth. Jack used his knowledge of the barn to his advantage, moving from one point of cover to another, a ghost in the storm. He knew the boys were safe in the cellar, but their image was a constant presence in his mind. The emotional stakes of this fight made terrifyingly real. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for their right to have a father. During a lull, as both men reloaded in the darkness, Thomas's voice cut through the storm, full of a bitter, mocking triumph. "Did you know Davies was playing us both the great railroad foreman? He promised me your land, your water rights, everything. Said it would be my reward for clearing out the other ranchers. A fine piece of irony, don't you think? Taking your home to give to me. He laughed a raw, broken sound, but he never intended to give it to me. Found the papers in his office. He planned to have me declared an outlaw and killed once the job was done, taking all the land for himself. We were both just pawns in his game, Callahan. Pawns in a rich man's war. The secondary twist landed with a thud. Thomas was not just a villain. He was a victim, too, his grief and rage manipulated by corporate greed. He was a pawn who thought he was a king. A sudden noise from outside the barn near the house drew both their attentions. A lantern shattered on the stone porch. For a heart-stopping second, Jack thought Rose and the boys had come out. Thomas thought so, too. Foolish woman. He snarled, rising from his cover to fire toward the sound. It was the opening Jack needed. But the diversion wasn't from Rose. The back door of the house creaked open, and David stood there for a split second, his face pale with terror and courage, before ducking back inside. He had created the diversion, his son showing a trust and bravery that filled Jack with a fierce protective love, had just saved his life. Jack didn't hesitate. He burst from his cover, closing the distance between them. Thomas spun around surprised and fired wildly. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Jack's duster, burning a hot line along his arm. Jack tackled him, sending them both crashing into the mud and hay on the barn floor. The gun flew from Thomas's hand. They wrestled, two men fueled by years of pain and hatred. Jack was stronger. He gained the upper hand, his fist connecting with Thomas's jaw. He pinned him to the ground, his Colt now pressed to Thomas's forehead. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn there was a sudden, terrible silence. Thomas stared up at him, his eyes not full of fear but of a weary, hateful acceptance. "Do it." Thomas rasped, a bloody smile on his lips. "Finish it. Avenge my brother's death by making another." This was the moment, the moral climax. To pull the trigger would be to perpetuate the cycle of violence, to become the monster Thomas believed him to be. To let him live would be to choose justice over revenge. He looked at the locket glinting in the dim light on Thomas's chest. He looked at the face of the man whose life he had ruined. He thought of David, of Luke, of Eleonora's belief in his redemption. With a guttural cry, he brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the side of Thomas's head. The man went limp, unconscious. Jack stood up, breathing heavily, the rain-soaked air burning in his lungs. He reached down and retrieved the locket, its silver cool against his skin. Then he looked at the unconscious man at his feet. "This ends now," he said, not to Thomas, but to the ghosts of the past. The act was done. His redemption was not in killing, but in choosing not to. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world washed clean. In the pale light of dawn, Jack turned Thomas Blackwood and a lockbox full of incriminating evidence against Mr. Davies over to the federal authorities, who had arrived on the morning train, completely bypassing Sheriff Miller and the local corruption. With Thomas's testimony and Davies's own ledgers, the railroad scheme of greed and intimidation unraveled. The ranchers who had been forced out were given their land back, and a semblance of justice returned to the valley. Redemption. The town began to live up to its name. Jack returned home not as a conquering hero, but as a father weary to his bones. The locket was safe in his pocket, its weight a comforting, familiar presence. He found Rose and the boys in the kitchen, their faces etched with relief. He knelt and pulled both his sons into a fierce embrace, burying his face in their hair, overwhelmed by the simple, profound fact that they were safe, that they were together. That evening, he sat them down by the fire. It was time for the final truth, the one that mattered most. He told them the full story of Daniel Blackwood not sparing himself. He explained his lie, his guilt, and the terrible price of his mistake. He spoke to them not as children to be protected from the world, but as young men who deserved the respect of the truth. Luke listened with wide, uncomprehending eyes, but David listened with a startling maturity. He heard the pain in his father's voice, saw the burden he had carried alone for so long. When Jack finished, the silence in the room was no longer oppressive, but gentle understanding. David, the boy who mimicked his father's stoicism, who had built his own walls against grief, stood up. He walked over to his father, and in a gesture of forgiveness and maturity that was beyond his years, he placed a small hand on Jack's shoulder. It was a simple touch, but it healed a wound that had festered for a decade. Months later, a new peaceful rhythm had settled over the ranch. Life had found its footing, rooted in the hard-won soil of their shared history. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the easy sounds of a family. Luke's laughter as he chased chickens in the yard, David's quiet questions as he learned to mend a saddle alongside his father, and Rose's soft humming as she worked in her garden. The house beneath the canyon walls was no longer a tomb of grief, but a home filled with a quiet, resilient warmth. One clear autumn afternoon, Jack led them to the small, windswept hill where Eleonora was buried. A simple wooden cross marked the spot overlooking the valley she had loved. He had told Rose and the boys that it was time to close the final chapter, to make peace with all the ghosts. He knelt by the headstone, the dry grass whispering around him. From his pocket, he pulled the silver locket. It was polished now, the intricate engravings of their initials E and J shining in the afternoon sun. He didn't put it back around his neck. Instead, with a final gentle touch, he hung it from the arm of the wooden cross, leaving it to rest with her. It was an act of letting go, of acknowledging that his love for her was now a part of this land, a memory to be honored, not a relic to be carried. Then he turned to his family. He pulled the small, worn wooden bird from his other pocket, the one Luke's mother had carved. He had found it on Luke's bedside table that morning, the boy having finally set it down. He held it out to Rose. Her eyes filled with tears as she took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, familiar lines. "This family has two roots," Jack said, his voice steady and clear, his gaze moving from Rose to his sons. "Both of them make us strong." It was not a replacement, but an acceptance. An act of honoring the past, while fully embracing the future. They were building together a future that included all of its parts, both the beautiful and the broken. Rose closed her hand around the wooden bird, a silent promise passing between her and Jack. As the sun began to dip behind the canyons, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, they turned and started for home. Jack walked with his arm around Rose, while David and Luke walked ahead, their long shadows stretching out before them. They walked together, a family made whole, not by forgetting their scars, but by learning to live with them, united and finally free from the shadows of the past.